We have a very esteemed panel put together. So Randy Schrum has joined us. He's our chief organizer. He is a CPA accountant, does nonprofit audits. His company, Marshall Jones, has been a real supporter of ours. He brought along some friends. So we have William Jarvis and Mary Ellen Garrett, who are with Merrill Lynch. They're the people you want to get to know because they're on the investment side. They manage endowments, they advise endowments. So Randy helps you set them up, and William and Mary Ellen help you figure out to make the most money and manage them. And then a colleague from the trenches, I talked Mike Dunlap to joining us. Mike is, we met as he was the treasurer of the Center for Puppetry Arts at a time when he was actually having to use the endowment in some creative ways. And he has some tips to share as the treasurer and as a board member of how an endowment comes in handy. So that is our panel. So with that, William, take it away.
Lovely to be with all of you today. Thanks for joining. As you can see, we have an agenda here with the concepts that we're going to be referring to. I'll do the first Roman 2 and 3, the key concepts and the overview, and then we'll jump into other aspects of fiduciary responsibility. And as Kathy said, go to some concrete experiences. So if we turn the page now, what we're going to talk about here is really understanding what your organization has in terms of funding and endowments. That discernment part is very important for you as a staff member or as a trustee. Then we're going to be a little boring but a little interesting and go into the fiduciary duties that you have to obey. These are the legal principles. Then we'll talk about portfolio construction. That's a fancy word for deciding how you're going to run your investments and why. And then governance, the behavior of a board, the behavior of a trustee and staff. So now that we've set the map here, let's get going. Next page, please. Good. I don't think it takes an encyclopedia to tell you, you as nonprofit trustees or staff fill a very unique role in American society. Other countries don't have this kind of sector. You offer your time, your talent, your treasure, your lifetime skills, or you encourage or recruit others. And sometimes these governance functions can be a little bit, if not opaque, sometimes vague, depending on how your organization is established and how it's run, understanding the needs, priorities, strengths, constraints, responsibilities. And so what we're going to do here is really talk through those issues, a framework. And this is based on a paper that we have that we'll be distributing to you on request afterward, the first principles of governance, understanding your role on a nonprofit board. I wrote that paper. That's my subject matter expertise. So we're here giving you a digest of those materials. So next slide, please. So what are the characteristics that you all have in common? Looking at the chat and the different types of organizations, you have operating charities, you've got educational institutions, you've got some foundations, but the general common characteristic is, first of all, that your activities are for the benefit of society or for a class of beneficiaries that was identified by the organization or by its founders, different from a business corporation, which is for the enrichment or benefit of particular individuals or classes of them, stockholders, and so on. So in this sense, regardless of whether you have strong voices in your room, in your directors' meetings, and so on, no one can really be said to own a nonprofit or its assets. And this even goes to family foundations. Once the family has taken that tax exemption, they don't really own that foundation anymore. It belongs to the public purpose for which it was set up. Other characteristics, generally speaking, although there are some nonprofits that have a limited existence, generally speaking, your organizations are formed with a view to a perpetual existence, and that goes very directly to how you're going to invest and govern your investment function. And you're also substantially free from taxation, with an important asterisk: private foundations, where you pay an excise tax each year and you have to make annual qualified distributions that average at least 5% of your assets, and this goes to your spending practice. There's an asterisk on the asterisk, and that is that some very large educational institutions with big endowments also have to pay an excise tax, but I don't think we need to discuss that here. Next page, please. So when we talk about endowments, what are we really talking about? Generally speaking, a restriction as to use or purpose. So that's a donor restricted endowment. And we have some gap principles here, securities, cash, other assets to provide income for the maintenance. But typically, from your point of view, these endowments are made up of individual gifts from donors who may impose restrictions on how the gift is to be used. Sometimes, though, you do have unrestricted endowment, where the donor will say, I'm going to give this to you for the general purposes of your organization, and you may decide how it's to be used for your purpose. Fortunately, we saw an increase in that during the COVID-19 pandemic, COVID-related giving in the studies that we've done. You also have reserves, which can be operating surpluses that you've accumulated, other types of monies, and sometimes boards will create these as what's called board designated or quasi-endowment, and they'll decide to manage it like an endowment pursuant to a board resolution. And at private foundations, as I mentioned, the endowment is typically created by a donor or a family. That is often settled at one time or over a period of years. And generally speaking, private foundations do not receive further funds. They don't engage in fundraising the way public charities do. So that's a characteristic of those organizations. So when we talk about this, now we bring it to you. And there are two big kinds of differences between endowment investing and individual investing. For many of you, you may be successful individual investors, you may be successful in your businesses, but you are always, first of all, mortal, and second, you are always taxable. Endowments are almost always, as I've said, perpetual or immortal and generally tax exempt. And this will influence the way you're thinking about investing and approaches to investing. So next page, please. And in this sense, regardless of how you invest for your own account, endowment investing requires this so-called balancing of interests between the interests of the present and the interests of the often unborn or voiceless future. And this is this concept called intergenerational equity. Put in concrete terms, it means the future generations of beneficiaries should not be advantaged or disadvantaged by the endowment investing and spending taking place today. So in mathematical terms, that means that generally speaking, your endowment's purchasing power has to be maintained after allowing for spending, inflation, and costs. So if a person gives a certain amount today, it's not sufficient to preserve that nominal dollar amount because we all know that inflation will eat away at the purchasing power of it and it won't be able to do the same amount of good works. The idea is to preserve that purchasing power so that out into the indefinite future, that endowment can do the same quantum of good works that the donor intended. Next page. And now we're going to go to fiduciary duty for just a few minutes, and then I'm going to hand it over to Randy. This is the legal basis on which endowment governance rests. It comes from our English common law traditions, and it is a very high standard of conduct, one of the highest, even higher than the things, the care that you give to your own affairs and your own assets. And the three types of fiduciary loyalty are care, fiduciary duty are care, loyalty, and obedience. And we're just going to touch briefly on those before handing over to Randy. So the duty of care addresses how you carry out your duties or how a board director or a staff member carries out duties when acting on behalf of the nonprofit. So examples would be being sure that you attend meetings, preparing for them, staying informed in a way that you seek out sources of information that are reliable and not speculative. So taking the job seriously, addressing it with the degree of gravity that it requires. That's the duty of care. The next slide, we have the duty of loyalty. And this goes to your issues relating to conflict of interests. Here you have to put aside your own interests and act only in the interest of the organization when you are fulfilling that role as a fiduciary. So of course you all have conflict of interest policies, and if you don't, you should. But sometimes it's a little more subtle. So for example, if you're a fiduciary sitting on several boards, you might have to consider how a given opportunity might be directed. So this is something that requires good judgment, requires that the chair of the board be very involved, and that you think really with respect to hindsight. I mean, think about how something will look when that enterprising local reporter discovers that this thing occurred and you're having to explain it. What you want is for there to be nothing to see here, that it was all disclosed, or that this was taken care of through the conflict of interest policy. And then the final duty, which may address some of your issues, is this duty of obedience. Boards can sometimes drift. I mean, sometimes you have long-established organizations where you'll get dynamic leaders in who say, well, this is kind of boring. Let's go and do this new exciting thing over here. Careful. Your duty is to be sure that the organization remains true to the purposes set forth in its charter and its founding documents, and by the way, that it also observes donor intent in respect to the endowment and the purposes for which those gifts were given. Sometimes you do have cases in which nonprofits have been repurposed. A classic example that I put up here is raising funds for polio research in the 1950s. Those organizations redirected themselves to other childhood diseases when the polio vaccine was, thank goodness, developed. But generally speaking, you don't deviate from your founder's purpose. So with that overview, Randy, I'm going to hand it to you to talk about a very important law, the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act.
Thank you, Bill. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, we'll be talking about UPMIFA and specifically how it applies to any institution, which can be a charitable trust or nonprofit, holding funds for the charitable purpose subject to donor-imposed restrictions in a gift instrument, including endowment funds. It is a state law that governs behavior by fiduciaries of donor-restricted endowment funds when investing, spending, or delegating responsibility to a third party. This is a law that's been adopted in all the states except for one, that's Pennsylvania, but they do have similar laws and provisions. And it was adopted in the state of our state of Georgia in 2008. What we'll see here is all the UPMIFAs in different states are all very similar, but technically they're very different. So each nonprofit needs to comply with the law that's enacted in their state of incorporation. This is going to set a statutory standard of prudence for the behavior of fiduciaries who have the authority over these donor advised funds. And then they're designed to complement those three fiduciary duties that Bill just went over, duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. Next slide, please. So you should actively consider the specific issues that set forth in the law when investing, spending, and delegating, and document these actions in your board minutes. The concept of procedural prudence is intended to enable fiduciaries to demonstrate that the behavior complies with the standard of the law. It's important to integrate the process into your boards and committees' practice when discussing matters related to the endowment. And here, let's talk about what if a nonprofit has an older endowment and maybe they've got a board designation that really doesn't fit the needs of the current board of directors. Well, first of all, we're going to recommend that you go back to the donor. That'd be the first best practice. See if they can actually change how their restriction is, the terms related to that endowment. But what if, like I said, it's an older one, maybe it's 20 years old, you've reached out to the donor and you can't find them, or even worse, maybe they passed away now. The good news about UPMIFA, it actually provides a mechanism to modify a donor's restriction. So if there's a situation where the board wants to change the charitable restriction to an endowment, and it's either unlawful, impractical, impossible to achieve, or wasteful, and it's under $100,000, and it's more than 20 years old, and the organization is going to use it, then they intend to use it for your own charitable purpose. There's actually this mechanism that all you have to do is notify the state attorney general of the change in plans of the endowment. Now, if any of those criteria I just mentioned are not the case, there's still a mechanism, but that one you have to actually apply then to the attorney general, and that could be obviously longer and more drawn out. But there is a mechanism to relieve from that donor restriction that's not really currently helping the organization. Next slide, please. We know serving on the board of a nonprofit does require an act of humility. This is very frequently, board members are very successful business people in their own right. They have strong, specific ideas how the organization should be run. And they have their own experience from their own investment portfolios, and they believe maybe that's relevant. And it probably is, they're relevant or could be in their role as an endowment fiduciary. These are frequently infused with a passion for the mission of the organization that can lead them to be strong advocates for current spending at the expense of an unknown future. And there's a fine line, right, between we all want to serve the mission today, spend for the current mission, but that you're going to be torn against also you want to build reserves for the mission's future, their tomorrow, the investing part of it. And I've heard this described as kind of a Goldilocks. If you look at if a donor looks at a possible nonprofit's financial statements and look at their endowment, they see a large number. They may think, wow, that's so large, maybe this organization doesn't really need my support. And also maybe there's no endowment at all, or maybe negative equity. They're going to think maybe this is mismanaged. So you really, it's constant battle between what's that right number to maintain for the future of the organization. The next slide, please. There we go. Keep in mind that this endowment, as Bill said, does not belong to the fiduciaries or the board members. The board wants to make sure they are fulfilling the donor's purpose for which it was established, in which the donors have entrusted their faith and their gifts to the organization. The fact this may in fact, require the fiduciaries to act in ways that are different than they would be naturally or instinctively want to do. One thing to remember here, though, about UPMIFA, the board of directors are legally obligated to prudently manage and invest the endowment funds to maximize the organization's return on assets. And the key here is to maintain that long-term viability and short-term flexibility. And then the next slide. UPMIFA does have a financial reporting element. The board should develop and regularly review the policies and procedures that will govern the investment process of the endowment, frequently within audit statements that are made in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP. There is a footnote disclosure required around the UPMIFA. You must disclose the board's interpretation of UPMIFA, and in our case, as enacted in the state of Georgia. You have to disclose the investment spending policy, strategies, the composition of the endowment, and then finally a roll forward is going to show your beginning and ending balances and all the activity during the year. And these should all be embodied in an investment policy statement. That's a key document which is adopted by the board and should be reviewed and updated on an annual basis. And with that, I'm now going to turn it over to my very good friend, Mary Ellen Garrett of Merrill Lynch, and she's going to talk more about the investment policy statements.
Great, Randy. Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Randy, that was a terrific overview of the fiduciary regulation, the perspective, and also the behavior. And you're exactly right. One of the most important set of actions that a nonprofit and its board can take with respect to investing is the development and the regular review of the policies and the procedures that will govern the investment process for your organization. These are embodied in what Randy referred to as an investment policy statement, sometimes referred to as an IPS, which is a key document that is adopted by the board, and it should be reviewed at least on an annual basis. If you'll turn to slide 20, I'd like to expand on this topic just a bit. So on the screen, you'll see some questions to consider when formulating your organization's investment policy statement. For those of you who already have your IPS in place, there may be some questions that you haven't yet answered. And for those who have not created an IPS, these questions are a great starting point. And some of the questions include, what are the asset allocation targets? That just means, what percentage are you going to be placing inside of the different allocations of investments? How much goes to equity or stock? How much goes to fixed income or bonds? And how much stays in cash? Sometimes there's a position of alternative investments as well. What risk levels are appropriate? And are these allocation ranges permitted to vary? Other questions are, what is the endowment's liquidity, rebalancing, and spending policies? When should the board review the investment policy statement? And what are the roles and responsibilities of those involved in the oversight of endowment? Once your organization has these questions defined, you might be asking yourself, who is in charge of making sure the nonprofit adheres to the investment policies that are set in place? So if you'll go to the next slide, please. The governance of an endowment's investments is, in most cases, a collective enterprise, and that is involving the work of the organization's staff, the investment or the finance committee, and the full board acting in its role of overseer. We work very closely with the nonprofits that we manage, and we meet with them regularly, sometimes on a quarterly basis, sometimes semi-annual, and sometimes annually, to make sure that the overall investment for our clients' endowments is aligned with their investment policy statement at all times. So it's important for those nonprofits who are listening in to review internally and review at least annually. So let's take a look at the three different endowment management models that are available to your organization. The most common practice, and these are particularly for larger endowments, is to retain professional service providers who act under contracts to carry out their duties with respect to specific investment, management, and reporting functions under the oversight of the organization's staff, investment committee, and board. The first two models are, number one, something called an advice-based or consulting model. And this is where an investment consultant, typically serving in a non-fiduciary capacity, is hired to recommend investment managers to the board or to the investment committee. He or she will then review and monitor the recommendations and provide regular reports to the organization. The second model is something called an in-house staff model. And this is where the organization elects to build its own expert in-house investment staff to manage investments and to assess and monitor risk and compliance. This group may either work closely with a consultant or may undertake its own manager research, hiring, monitoring, possibly dismissing managers, and all subject to the oversight of the board or the investment committee. I'd like to focus on the final model, which is the discretionary management or the outsourced chief investment officer model, sometimes referred to as the OCIO. And if you'll turn to the next page, as you can see on the screen, the investment portfolios have become more complex and highly diversified. The two models that I just presented, the consulting and the in-house staff models, lack the flexibility to respond to events in volatile financial markets, while boards and investment committees have demanded greater accountability for performance and allocation decisions. Others have found it challenging to recruit, compensate, and retain sufficiently skilled, dedicated investment staff. So this is where the outsourced chief investment office model, sometimes also called discretionary management, this is where this type of model can be helpful to your organization. And this is a group of providers who have developed a range of discretionary investment management service models that are designed to serve as an extension of the organization's investment staff. The OCIO model is characterized by a high degree of customization with respect to both the type of assets being managed and the degree of discretion that's being granted. For some nonprofit organizations, the OCIO may only oversee investments such as less liquid investments that are thought by the board or the investment committee maybe to be too complex to be adequately overseen by the staff. For other organizations, the OCIO's mandate may extend to the entire range of assets in which the portfolio is invested. The degree of investment discretion granted to the OCIO may vary from organization to organization. So it's not uncommon for the OCIO relationship to evolve over time, beginning with a more restrictive approach and then gradually moving to a structure under which the nonprofit grants more discretion to the OCIO as the board and investment committee become more comfortable with the team. An appropriate version of the OCIO structure can enable the board or the investment committee to fulfill its fiduciary duty, focusing on those governance and policy issues that will have the greatest impact on the long-term viability of the organization.
Randy, while I have you on the mic here, you referred to the fact that UPMIFA, this Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, is a state law. So it does vary somewhat from state to state. Just so people know, because we have some people who are not Georgia nonprofits here on the call, that $100,000 and 20-year figure that you mentioned for smaller and older funds is Georgia specific. Every state has its own standard. So you should always consult your own counsel and become familiar with the form of UPMIFA that's been adopted in your state.
Yeah, great point, Bill.
Any recommendations on an OCIO? mean, isn't that what Merrill Lynch does?
Yes, and for those nonprofits that we have been given the responsibility of investment management, and I can tell you that all of them are the OCIO model.
Yeah.
And we provide that type of strategy. We work with the organization to provide the strategy and then to continue to present to the board, to the investment committee, finance committee, whomever is responsible at that organization level, to answer questions and to give reporting on how the investments are actually doing.
Do you see social responsibility required in the investment policy?
Yes, I can tell you that has been quite a source of questions, rebalancing the portfolios of late over the course of the last few years, where socially responsible investing and ESG investing is really becoming much more on the forefront of the investment strategy that we create. Some we've managed for years and they were not on that platform. And then we have recently, over the last couple of years, moved to that platform. And you think about the different organizations in the state of Georgia, different nonprofits, and those are being asked by their donor base as to how the investments for the organization are being managed to make sure that they are doing that. So yes, we're seeing that quite a bit, and we're going back to those who have not to make that recommendation to make some of those changes.
What we've talked about so far must sound as if it's impossible. There are constraints, right? You can't do everything at once. And so if we look at the next page, you're really trying to do, if we could have the next slide, please. You're really trying to optimize, say, 3 outcomes. First of all, as we said, a long-term risk-adjusted investment return that is as high as prudently achievable. Remember that prudence word. You also want to be able to distribute from the endowment as much as possible. That, consistent with this intergenerational equity concept, this balancing of interest, is as high as prudently achievable. But you also probably want to keep the volatility of the amount that's distributed by the endowment from year to year as low as prudently achievable. Why? Because you have to budget. You have to budget from year to year, and you don't want the amount that you're drawing from the endowment to be jumping up and down. So this means you have to make compromises in trying to optimize these. What are the tools that you have? They're on the next page. Asset allocation. We mentioned this already. Mary Ellen referred to it. How much of your portfolio is in stocks, bonds, cash, alternative assets? That's going to determine in large measure what your volatility of returns will be and what your absolute return will be as well. Second, the spending rate and spending methodology. How much are you going to spend from the endowment every year? And are you going to use some method to smooth it out so that you're not just taking, say, 5% of the endowment's value every year, because that will jump up and down based on whether the endowment has strong returns or losses. And you're going to try to smooth that out so that you can budget over a period of years. And then, as we mentioned earlier, new endowment fund flows. What's the situation with donors and with gifts? So on the next page, we say, first of all, asset allocation. This is the thing that you have to pay attention to. Over 90% of returns and variability in returns has been shown to be due to asset allocation decisions. So this is where you're going to need to rely on your OCIO, on your investment manager, to really show you how you can get, or how you're likely probabilistically to be able to get to the goal that you want to have, and that is mainly through asset allocation. Much more important than manager selection. And this again is where it's different from your individual investing, where you might say, oh, I have a friend who can get me into this particular hot hedge fund. No, you're not doing that here. This is a different game. It's a 20, 40, 60-year game. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, spending methodology, I have a paper, Mary Ellen can get it for you, on spending methods and practices. This is a way to reduce your volatility and promote the organization's ability to achieve its mission. It also is very helpful with donors, since donors like to see their endowments spent, but they like to see them spent in a rational way. And then finally, this diversification concept that we've referred to, Randy referred to it, Mary Ellen referred to it, many eggs in many baskets. You see the little graphic. We don't really know what the future will hold. And so you're going to put together a portfolio with different types of investments because they move in different ways. They don't all go up and go down at the same time. And in that sense, this is a very classic way that investments are constructed these days. It's been practiced beginning really in the 1950s and 60s, and this is the foundation for investment management of endowments today. Next slide, please. So the success here depends on what we call low correlation. As I mentioned, things don't go up and down together. Some should be going up while others are going down, and you can't predict, looking to the future, which ones will be going up and down at what times. So in this way, you can lessen the volatility of returns. Next. Now, the other thing that we mentioned here, and Randy, you didn't refer to this in your UPMIFA discussion, but it is sitting there in the law. UPMIFA requires prudent management of investment costs. And so this is a balancing again of costs in light of the returns that are being sought, part of those fiduciary responsibilities. And we did have a question about passive versus active, and there are ferocious arguments about which is, quote, better, which is not better. Sometimes index funds do return a better return than actively managed funds. That period has been one that we've been through in recent years, although it seems to have turned in the last year or so. But one of the characteristics of index funds, and Mary Ellen, I know you use these in the portfolios that you structure sometimes, is their costs can be very low. And if we're going to be in an environment, as many investors, including our own chief investment office, believe, that may have lower returns in the future, you want to be paying attention to those costs and being sure that you're not paying excessively high costs. So that balancing of costs in the consideration is also very important. And I think we have one more page. Yes, a couple pages here. Just to go now, many of you have boards, you're on boards, you're chairing boards, you have staff. The board needs to be reflective of the community it serves. And it needs to be reflective experientially so that it brings that richness of diversity of experience to the mission of the organization. This is not something that can happen overnight. In many cases, it takes years, a process of having a nominating committee, of really being discerning out in your community, but contributing constructively in terms of thinking of the long-term purposes of the endowment and the institution. This can be the way to build that stronger board. And obviously to govern the investment function as well. So with that, I'm now going to hand it back to Kathy to introduce our next section and Mike.
Mike is and has been the treasurer for the Center for Perpetual Arts. Mike is retired now, but long-term banker, bank president, commercial lender. The Center for Perpetual Arts tapped him and looped him into the treasurer role. And then working with their endowments, they had a campaign and raised quite a bit of money and found they needed to use it. So Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So the Center for Puppetry Arts, we like endowments, as Kathy mentioned on the front end. We like having an endowment. Our endowment today is around $3 million. And we have, interestingly enough, about 12 months ago, it was $2 million. So it's been a good run, and which is fortunate. The original endowment was established almost 20 years ago, and it was funded by fairly large foundations here in town. And the purpose was twofold: capital improvements and creative artistic programming. So we set up 2 tranches, and that still exists. The endowment has been increased over that time through infusions from a board member donation, and also through a capital campaign where we added funds to it. So that's also the designations that came with those were for the director's artistic and programming needs. And also a piece of it is for general endowment. And I absolutely would say that any future capital campaigns will have a piece in it for increasing the endowment as we can. Because as I say, it's proved out to be something that's very important to us. The endowment moved to a professional outsource about 12 years ago, and that was a very smart move, I feel like, on our part. We meet with our advisor at least twice a year and sometimes quarterly, and we get very professional and very detailed information on our investments and on movements and on their investment committee's views. And it's helped us stay the course and helped us, sort of stay focused and let them stay focused and let us stay focused on operating the center. And it's also helped educate our staff and help educate the board as well. And so we will continue down that path. As this slide was showing, you know, the way that we funded it, I've talked about that, and the types of endowments earlier were talked about. So the role of the board, as we've talked about throughout, is really, it is their responsibility to ultimately to oversee and to approve withdrawals and the use of the funds, especially during critical times. And the pandemic was one. And we also, as Kathy alluded to, I think earlier, as we had a transition of a founder that got particularly challenging, and we really, the endowment helped us fund certain things and was there to, and we felt like we checked with our auditors and other advisors, we were certainly within our realm of usage or the specifications of usage to use it that way. But it helped us, and we were creative with that. The center used the endowment, as said, we've used it for building repairs, for the founder transition, which was a critical time in our history, and that was fairly recent. And interestingly enough, that transition was followed fairly quickly by the pandemic, which was interesting timing. We've also used it for underwriting new creative works, and honestly, just where we can, we pull it out as we fund the operations throughout, you know, from year to year as part of our budgeting process. We meet and coordinate, collaborate with finance staff, with the leadership, the board, and the finance committee, and we talk about it often. We talk about all of this monthly, and we're constantly checking in on, it's just part of our process, it's part of our rhythm, it's part of, you know, how we think of funding the center. And if we don't need it, I mean, we want to use it, but if we don't need it, we certainly will pare back on it or use it for things that are maybe not as pressing. The role of the auditor has been very helpful to, very important to us to advise on the MIFA and really just the standards for withdrawals and usage. Especially during, you know, these times where we had to get creative and during the crisis. I mean, literally, we, like a lot of not-for-profits early on in the pandemic, were asking ourselves, can we survive? And how deep can we go into this endowment without going to jail? I mean, I don't know. We didn't know what the ramifications would be, you know, just how much trouble could we get in. But I mean, you're sitting on, say, $3 million at the time, maybe $2 million. You can't perform. You can't have people come to your museum. You have virtually zero. Fortunately, the government came through and helped us, and we did some other things to get to the point where we think we'll be thriving again. But there was a scary time, and we were looking hard at the endowment and just how hard we could go into it, and just how extreme the usage could be. And our auditor was very, you know, got us educated on MIFA and helped us understand our history of usage and what would sort of be stepping well beyond the bounds and what might be stepping over. It's certainly the 5%, but was not, you know, horrendous in the usage. So that's all worked out. Lessons learned. Professional advisor, fiduciary is just critical. I think I would advise anyone who has an endowment to go with the outsourced model. You know, balanced investment, or I should say more there, you know, a disciplined approach based on what information that we've given our advisor and what we're trying to accomplish. And so they've kept us focused, and we've worked together well in a partnership. It's very important to have an endowment. It really is. I mean, through crisis and just through normal operations, it's just a very important thing to focus on. If you don't have one, you know, get busy on putting together a plan. And then just to utilize all of your advisors, auditors, board members, bank, et cetera.
This was our first foray about endowments. We think it's going to be a hot topic coming out of the pandemic because so many people have been in Mike's situation where they had one to use and didn't. And so the boards are talking about how do we build them? How do we create them going forward? All right. Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate everyone coming. Look forward to more conversations and thank you.